Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, I see that Mr. Denton is also online. Maybe we can quickly check the video and the sound. Mr. Denton, are you there? Yes, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself. Yes.
Apologies. Got it?
Yes, perfect. We have it.
Yes. So thank you to everyone for joining this UN Global Compact Academy session. We will get started in just a minute or two. In the meantime, if you're joining through Zoom, you're welcome to use the group chat function to share where you're joining us from today. And you can also use that function later in this session to ask questions. But please stand by, we'll start in just 1 minute. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Ole Hansen. I'm the Chief of Global Operations here at the UN Global Compact. And I'd like to thank you all for joining this session of the Global Compact Academy and our special series on uniting business to respond to COVID-19. We have a really exciting panel for today's discussion, and it's great to see that we have participants joining us from many parts of the world through Zoom and through YouTube. I see people already joining from Spain, Lithuania, Kenya, Pakistan, Portugal, Lagos, London, Nairobi, Chile. Really great to have you all. Thank you so much for joining. As I said earlier, you can use the chat function also to ask questions throughout the panel. And I'd like to thank those of you who asked questions already before the panel. We try to reflect those questions in today's discussion. So as we all know, COVID-19 is not only a severe global health crisis. The pandemic has already had extensive socioeconomic impacts and is putting thousands of companies around the world at risk of going out of business and millions of people at risk of losing their jobs. This crisis is, of course, hitting small businesses and their workers particularly hard, and that's what we will be talking about today. In this Academy session, which we organized together with the International Chamber of Commerce, we're putting the spotlight on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. We'll have a conversation about what can and what must be done to help those smaller companies survive COVID-19, looking not least at the role of multinational large companies as well as that of governments. So for this important discussion, we have, as I said, a truly exciting panel, and I'm happy to welcome the panelists and now to this discussion. First, I'm pleased to introduce John W.H. Denton, the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC. In response to this pandemic, the ICC has launched a call to action to save our SMEs, the SOS campaign, that hopefully you can tell us a bit about today, John, and we're really pleased that you're hosting today's session with us at the ICC. Next, a warm welcome to Peter Ndegwa, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Safaricom. Safaricom is a UN Global Compact participant, a lead company, and a champion of sustainable and inclusive business in Africa for many years. Also, thank you to you, Peter, for joining us today. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Mortaza Ahmed to the panel. Mortaza is Managing Director at Artistic Milners and based in Pakistan. You're also a Global Compact participant, and Mortaza has personally been recognized as an SDG pioneer for your work on gender equality and decent work. Welcome to you. And then last, but definitely not least, I'm honored and pleased to introduce Dorothy Tempo, who is the Interim Executive Director of the International Trade Center, an international organization fully dedicated to supporting the competitiveness of micro, small, and medium-sized companies, and therefore perfectly positioned to enlighten us all during this panel discussion today. So thanks again to all four of you for joining us today. Let's get started. So I'd like to open this discussion by asking each of you to just briefly share some overall reflections on the impact of the current crisis on small businesses and their employees. So if I could ask you first, John, maybe you could talk a little bit about when and how you at the ICC started noticing the impact that the COVID-19 were having on small businesses and their workers, and also if there are any particular trends, globally speaking, that you've observed so far that are the most important ones in terms of how smaller companies are affected.
Oh, look, thanks very much, Oleg. And it's great to be here. And please, big shout out to Lisa. Commend her and a shout out to her for her service to the Global Compact over so many years. And it's great to have Peter on here because having read all the press, it looks like Safari.com will actually be even more intimately involved with the Global Compact with the appointment of your colleague to the role to replace Lisa Pete. So welcome. Where did I first find out about this? So actually, it's quite an extraordinary. Some of you might know I'm an Australian. In fact, I was in Australia over summer. And some of you might also know that Australia over summer was basically a firestorm, and I'd been evacuated. And I was actually, towards the end of January, I was just launching a campaign in Australia called Green Up Australia, which was designed to actually support SMEs and micro SMEs in regional Australia who'd suffered from the bushfires. And I was in the process of launching that and flying back to Paris, where I'm based, and I came via Hong Kong. As many of you would know, the ICC is an extraordinary institution. We are present in every continent in over 110 countries. We're the institutional voice of 45 million businesses. We have quite a significant footprint in East Asia. Coming back through Hong Kong, I was starting to talk to colleagues there about what they were seeing. And that's when we first started to think about the potential consequences of COVID on a global basis. Because up until that stage, it had been relatively contained as an epidemic with the threat of a pandemic emerging. But the sort of challenges that we now all live with, as though they're actually part of our lives, were not truly upon us at that point in time. Frankly, it was only when consumption and demand broke down that we started to see the truly dramatic impact on supply chains and actually on SMEs and micro SMEs. And in a way, you can kind of pinpoint it to when US shoppers decided to stop going out even before there were restrictions. Because what you saw was an immediate close down in demand. And the way that whole garment chain, value chain operates, saw an extraordinary devastation go along the whole of the supply chain all the way down to Bangladesh. And in Bangladesh, which is an economy which is in a way devoted itself as having picked a sector on garment industry, you saw an immediate impact of COVID-19 even before the physical impact of the pandemic had reached Bangladesh. And that's something we're seeing more and more of. But the reality here is we saw a supply chain collapse effectively within 36 hours. And the reason I sort of reference a little bit to East Asia was that East Asia is a logistics hub. And in Hong Kong, for example, where some of the most significant logistics companies operate, they started seeing immediately this replicate across other supply chains. So we saw, I mean, if you like, the canary in the gold mine, in the coal mine was the garment sector, but we saw the same issues there percolate across all supply chains. And that's when we decided to launch our Save Our SME campaign, because the point we were trying, and point we have made, I think, successfully now, to governments at the G20 level, international financial institutions, regional governments, and elsewhere, this is not a replay of the global financial crisis. This is an attack, effectively a fundamental attack on the real economy, and the real economy comprises SMEs and micro SMEs, who genuinely and generally account for 80 to 90% of almost all economies. And when you look at employment levels, it can be plus 90% as well. And of course, they dominate in a way the informal economy as well. And so the rule book or the playbook, which was applied for the global financial crisis, is just not appropriate for an attack on the real economy. And so different approaches needed to be considered in order to save the real economy, which is we save our SMEs. And the other problem we have with the pandemic is it's not only unkind in its perniciousness, it is also asymmetric, or asynchronic. It doesn't operate with synchronicity. At the same time, in the Northern Hemisphere, we're talking about how do we help businesses reopen. We're still in emerging economies talking about how do we stop them closing. And I came off a call on Friday with 34 different countries, the Chambers of Commerce and Businesses in Africa, where we're talking about the particular issues there, because each region is different as well in terms of the implications. So that's where we first found out about it. That's what motivated us to launch this campaign, because we wanted to shift policymakers to the dramatic realization this was not global financial crisis part 2. This was an attack on the real economy. Different tools, different policies are necessary, and we actually have to act quickly to actually open up liquidity and actually support these enterprises.
Great. Thank you so much, John. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Murtaza, again from Artistic Millionaires and based in Asia yourself. So this attack on the real economy that John was talking about, could you talk a little bit about here as a way of introduction, how that has affected your own company, and also what impact you've seen with smaller companies in your supply chain?
Right. So thanks, Ole, and thanks, John, for highlighting the demand destruction happening in the small to medium enterprises. I think what's interesting to first understand is already the small to medium enterprises, especially in the garment supply chain, already work on very, very low margins. They work generally with no credit facilities. Small businesses generally work with no credit facilities. So this kind of an impact due to the pandemic has put them in this situation where they don't have credit lines. Most of them, at least some of the vendors that Artistic Millionaires works with, have never worked with a bank. The suppliers who supply you with the thread or the small parts that are important in a textile apparel garment, right? So there's severe impact over there, especially to the people involved in that business, the employees. People are going on unpaid leaves. So I think that part of the garment industry is severely impacted and almost neglected by the global apparel community. As far as manufacturers are concerned, like ourselves, we still have, because we have worked with banks, we have credit facilities, We have very good partners in the Western world, and I must say this: some of our partners have done a fantastic job. Most retailers have done very, very well. There's a lot of negative press on retailers, but I think some of them have done exceptionally well in ensuring that the supply chain remains to be smooth. Because at the end of the day, in order to revive the whole industry, the supply chain will have to be ready to react when demand comes. So I think the smaller enterprises are huge on inventory right now. They're cash strapped, and it looks very difficult for them. So that's where they are at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you so much for those insights. Like to turn now to you, Peter, from Safaricom, clearly from the perspective here of the largest telecommunication company in Kenya. Do you see some of those same developments and trends, and what in particular may you have observed in terms of the impact among your smaller business customers?
Thank you for having me, and thank you to the other panelists for discussing what is a very important topic. So I joined Safaricom as a new CEO from the 1st of April, so almost 2 months in. So joined at a time when the world, of course, is facing a major crisis. But I've actually worked with many large organizations, and I have been very close to the SME sector because of the impact they have, either as customers through the value chain or as suppliers. So coming into Safaricom, I have been very attentive to the impact that the crisis has on SME, and I can relate with what both John and my other colleague has said. For those who don't know Safaricom, we are the largest telecom business in Eastern Africa, but we are more than a telecom business. We run the most successful mobile money business across the region called M-Pesa. So actually, we do see a wide section of SME, either as customers, direct customers, or as partners through the value chain, whether they are dealers, agents, or indeed suppliers. Today, we work with approximately 275,000 SMEs and micro SMEs. But in Kenya, we estimate that there is almost 7 million SMEs, including those in the informal sector, of which about 1.5 million are registered, and of which about 600,000 are active. So we work with approximately half of those 600,000, and indirectly through the M-Pesa platform, we serve most of the rest of either micro or small SMEs. So what have we seen? We have seen a significant impact through our M-Pesa platform. We can read. We have what we call Lipa na M-Pesa, which is pay with M-Pesa merchants, which we have 173,000. So we can read what's happening in the economy spread across various sectors, and we have seen significant reduction in economic activity, in particular sectors that have been most affected: tourism, leisure, entertainment, retail. It's a study done by the Kenyan Association of Manufacturers with the KPMG that says about 10% of SMEs don't believe they'll survive the crisis. And actually, if you look at manufacturers themselves, it's about a quarter uncertain whether they will survive through the crisis. And we are only 2 months in. So it is quite clear, and we have made SME the #1 priority in terms of supporting during the crisis, but also in particular post the crisis during the recovery phase, because they are a big enabler of the economy. 80% of the economy relies on SME. We've seen significant demand of data, especially as SMEs start to work and enable their employees to work from home. We've seen demand for cashless transfer and pay pay remotely. We've seen demand for remote working tools like the ones we are using today. And indeed, we have seen a lot more a kind of demand for digitization tools that allow SMEs to reduce their cost, to have visibility of their operations, but also to be able to enable them to access funding. So SME will be a major area that us as a business, as a purpose-driven business, will focus on both during, but also during the crisis, but also during the recovery phase.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks for sharing those insights. Very alarming figures, clearly also coming out of Kenya, and what a turbulent time to be joining the company. I'm excited now to turn it over to Dorothy Tembo from the International Trade Center. I know that you've been running a global survey to also better understand how this pandemic is affecting SMEs. Do you see the same picture as our other panelists have been painting? What are some of the key insights from this survey? If you could help us understand that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this distinguished panel this morning. Very interesting observations or comments being made by my colleagues on the panel, which are more or less attesting to some of the work or analysis that we have undertaken to this point. Let me start by saying that this is our business impact survey, which we launched in April in collaboration with our partners in the various countries where we are present. And out of this survey, we've had almost 1,200 observations that have been made. But for this morning's purposes, I thought I could perhaps try to zero in on those that I think are important and perhaps relate more to the conversation we are having. The first point is that the survey that we undertook confirms what we all were seeing starting to happen, which was the fact that micro, small, and medium enterprises were being negatively impacted by COVID-19. So in the context of the survey, this particular aspect is actually one that has been confirmed. Clearly from the respondents that we had, 60% of them said they have been strongly affected. When you look at this with a lens that focuses on least developed countries, that number actually goes up to 75% of them saying they have been negatively impacted in very challenging ways. But going beyond that, 40% of those are also saying they are unlikely to survive. So this is the type of scenario that we are dealing with. Second point, which perhaps also speaks to what John earlier on unpacked and has been spoken to by the other two panelists, is the fact that we have established that the impact has been more on women and youth. Youth, because a lot of them have very small businesses, as others have indicated, but also a large number, I think, going beyond that, are more in the informal business, on the informal business side of things, and have very little resources at their disposal. So it has been quite challenging for them to actually be able to have continuity to what they're doing. Linked to that is the fact that a number of them have not been able to transition to use different modes of doing business, as they have indicated to us. But I do recognize that within there, we also have those that have managed to transition, which perhaps would be the last point that I deal with. The third element is, again, one that has spoken to the supply chains and the effects that this has had on the demand. I think it has triggered, from our analysis, clearly a cash crisis for MSMEs, and which has only, increased what was already a challenging situation for most of the businesses to be able to have access to finance. it is something I think someone said earlier on that, you know, for these MSMEs, it has already been a challenging time. In many ways, they cannot access finance to be able to, you know, pump into their businesses to be able to grow. But at the same time, there are many other aspects which perhaps time permitting I could speak to, which have been constraints. And this situation only compounds a situation that has already been quite challenging. But to end on a positive note, and which speaks, I think, a lot to what Peter has already highlighted, the survey actually has shown us that within these challenging times, there've also been some opportunities that have come up. Some of what we are seeing from our side is that we have businesses that are moving from the mainstream production to focus on producing items that are needed in this special circumstance. What am I talking about? We've had, for instance, Gambian artisans reconverting themselves into medical suppliers of masks and outfits. We also have seen from this analysis that there is an increasing transition for those that can manage to move more to the digital space and be able to do their business via e-commerce or indeed through the mobile solutions that are at their disposal. So in all these very challenging times, but it also shows us that there could be potentially some opportunities that could be leveraged and maximized for the small businesses. And this perhaps is where the focus in terms of an organization like ours should be in terms of repositioning some of these companies.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing those insights, and also some of the opportunities that you see for some companies. But I guess it's very clear from the panelists already, from all of you, that it is a very serious situation all around the world for SMEs in terms of very significantly reduced demand, lack of access to finance, and many other problems. So let's talk a little bit about what can be done, what must be done. Looking also maybe first at the role of larger companies, multinational supply chain leaders. Turning it back to you, John, we both mentioned that you've launched this SOS campaign where you call on both governments and corporates to take action. So if we talk a little bit about the private sector and the larger companies, can you tell us a little bit about what it is that you're calling for, for example, large supply chain leaders and bigger companies? What can they do to help smaller companies in this situation?
Thanks, Ole. That's great. As I said, we launched Save Our SMEs because we genuinely believe there needs to be a change of focus, not just on the way in which large supply chain leaders and governments think about the real economy and their impact on it, but also the speed with which they operate. We've actually, like all these things, we've got a series of calls to action. But the particular 5 calls to action for supply chain leaders, I think, are pretty pertinent and also reflect very much some of the principles that the Global Compact also has articulated as well. The first is that don't forget, the pandemic is in its essence a fundamental and profound attack on the health of citizens and individuals. And so for any business leader, we must always be concerned about the health of the employees with whom we work, but also of their families. So the first thing we say is that the supply chain leaders need to ensure the health and safety of their workforce in their supply chains by sharing business continuity guidance and support. A strange fact, or perhaps an interesting fact for people, is the absence of business continuity plans in a lot of emerging economies. And it's one of our tasks has been to ensure that we've made those available. But in the future, I think, and also now, it's really important for supply chain leaders to ensure that companies that are in their supply chains have, are you okay there? Sorry, I'm hearing some feedback. Actually have business continuity plans. The second is, and this is probably pretty straightforward, though there's been some challenges here, uphold contracts with suppliers and distributors, especially in cases where the fulfillment of orders is already underway. You know, we have seen multiple examples where even when there's been a contract which has been fulfilled and the goods have been provided, there's been a refusal to actually pay for the goods provided. And that's partly because companies are seeking to maintain their own liquidity. But the consequence of this is, I think Peter said earlier, and others have said on the panel, is we can never forget that SMEs have very little liquidity. And so what you're doing is endangering the actual financial livelihood of an SME when you withhold payment. And that's actually causing a huge amount of stress. The third thing is to facilitate continued business operations of the supply chain. So you need to continue to work on that. Don't withdraw from your supply chain. Look at how you can ensure its resilience in the future. And this is very much in line with Global Compact. Insist on integrity and responsible business conduct within the supply chain. This is an incredibly important issue. We still need to ensure that the way in which we go about procuring our goods is actually done with integrity. And actually, supply chain leaders have a role in advocating with governments for stimulus efforts that flow into the real economy. And as I said before, I mean, one of the problems we're seeing is that a number of approaches being used by governments reflect a playbook from the global financial crisis, where a lot of the funds are flowing through intermediation through banks and are not getting, or are actually the actual process of accessing those funds is so convoluted that SMEs and micro SMEs cannot access those funds in a timely fashion. And they do not have the luxury of time on their side. Obviously, we've seen some tremendous leadership from a number of large companies who are generally also members of the Global Compact and part of the ICC. But there's a legion of examples where this is not, these five principles we articulated have not been complied with. We understand that multinationals will seek to preserve their cash flow in the short term, but they also need to keep an eye on the midterm to avoid their supply chains evaporating just as demand returns to the global economy. Governments, to be sure, have a key role to play. And as I said before, it's important and critical that governments prioritize support for small businesses in their stimulus packages. Many already have, but not enough are actually focused on how you actually get the cash out there. We should never forget that regulatory reforms that were initiated after the global financial crisis have actually made it more difficult for credit to be made available to SMEs and micro SMEs. We're seeing already that there's some challenges in what's called the trade finance market, with traders dropped significantly. At the moment, there's a level of stability in that market. But what I can tell you is if we want the economy to recover and trade to recover, we see a significant shortfall between what is available and what is needed. We're talking, I launched a campaign with finance ministers last week identifying a $5 trillion shortfall in trade finance. And we need to stimulate that through getting additional funds available through multilateral development banks, through getting more funds available through export credit agencies, and getting a lot more flexibility into the Basel III settings as well. So all these things need to happen to ensure that the trade finance is available to enable these inventories to be held and to be then shopped into the supply chains if we want to get a recovery happening. This is incredibly important because not only are we talking about saving lives from the pandemic, but as you know, we're also talking about how we preserve livelihoods. So there's sort of things that I think governments need to focus on and supply chain leaders as well.
Thank you so much, John. That's indeed a very strong call for action and a very necessary one. I'd like to turn it back to you, Murtaza, from Artistic Milliners and hear a little bit about also what you've done. Maybe before doing so, John, you alluded to also the UN Global Compact has put out an appeal for companies to respond to COVID-19 in alignment with the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact across human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And indeed, that appeal gives special attention to small and medium-sized companies, and encourage really our participants to respond towards those SMEs with flexibility, compassion, solidarity, because we all know, and as you're all talking about it here today, that it is more important than ever to ensure decent working conditions in the global supply chains. So Mortaza, you're a Global Compact participant, and I know you've been doing a number of things also over the last couple of months to support suppliers and SMEs. Could you talk just a little bit about what some of those most important things are, and also what you see as the most important role for multinationals in order to enable garment manufacturers to ensure business continuity in this crisis?
Right. Yes. So I think if I start off with the last part of your question first, I think the role of multinationals to secure the supply chain, which starts from us and then goes down to the medium and small enterprises, is essentially pay on time, uh, do not cancel goods, as John was mentioning, uh, and 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 plan the future better. The good part is, like I said earlier, a lot of multinationals realize that, because if they do not act responsibly, then they stand to reduce the strength of their supply chain, which in the future they will need, and they will need very soon, actually. We're already seeing numbers, retail numbers go up in North America, despite the fact that there's no vaccine, despite the fact that cases continue to rise. So I think there's a general understanding that the supply chain needs to be preserved. What our company is doing at the moment, just to bring this into context, Artistic Millionaires is the third largest exporter from Pakistan. Um, we manufacture our own yarn, our own fabric, and our own garments. We have a workforce of around 10,000 people. What we've been doing internally in our company is to ensure that that our workers are well paid, so that they can observe the lockdown the way that they should. We As soon as we heard about the lockdown in our country, we went ahead and paid advance salaries to all our colleagues, which I think is very important. Uh, of course, we've been paying full salaries for all the lockdown days, despite the fact that we have not been operational. And we went ahead and paid a bonus last month, um, earlier this month. Sorry, we went ahead and paid a bonus just to make sure that that people had the right amount of resources to carry on. Uh, I think what's very important right now is for us to understand exactly the challenges that the workforce is facing. For example, we're having a lot of our workforce that is isolated at the moment, as interprovincial travel is banned in Pakistan, and I'm sure that logistics and transportation is discouraged in all Asian countries right now due to the lockdown. So a lot of workforce is isolated. A lot of workforce wants to get back to work, cannot get back to work. um, so there's multiple challenges. As far as SMEs are concerned, what we're doing is, because we have a very strong group of partners, we're ensuring that we are paying our small to medium enterprise partners. We're ensuring that we're providing them with the right information for them to pursue the government. The Pakistani government has actually been very, very responsive to this situation, especially for the export sector in the country, as it employs a very large workforce. So there's a payroll financing scheme in place now that all enterprises can access. The only concern here for small and medium enterprises is that most of them do not have a record of working with banks. They don't have a history, so banks don't often lend. And that's what I think John was also mentioning, that it's a pre it's kind of a 2008 global crisis playbook, and that playbook is not necessarily applicable during the pandemic. So I think we need to re-strengthen, reorganize, brainstorm on how governments can react, so that they can really have an impact down the line.
Great. Thank you so much, Murtaza. Sounds like some very important initiatives that you're taking. I know, Peter, from in Safaricom, you talked a little bit about this already, but I know, for example, you've launched an initiative called Bonga for Good, I believe, and probably have done a number of other things that other companies can learn from as well. Can you share a little bit what you see as some of those things that larger companies can do to support SMEs in this time, including a bit about this initiative of yours?
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, so so I'll explain to the audience what the Bonga for Good is. We know, and I think a number of the panelists have said that although this is a health crisis, it is a bigger social and economic crisis, especially given how vulnerable MSMEs are in our continent, but also how important they are. So we recognize that, and in April we launched something we are calling Bonga for Good. Bonga in Swahili is to speak or to talk, and it is we have had a loyalty scheme as part of our GSM business, which is the loyalty for spending on voice or data, and you'd get loyalty points. And there was a lot of accumulated loyalty points by customers, both retail customers, but also enterprise corporate customers, including SMEs. So we thought previously the customers would redeem these points based on products, so voice or SMS or data. But we thought that it is important that during this period we support food, so buying food, but also other essentials for people who are in vulnerable positions. So we launched Bonga for Good, which is customers can donate their points to people who are vulnerable. And we have seen significant fourfold increase, half of which has actually gone to Bonga for Good. And this is about, say, an SME having employees and then donating their points, their corporate points, to those employees who might be in need of food or who don't have a job at this stage and therefore will need some money to keep them going. It's been extremely successful, both at a retail but also at a corporate level. And you can redeem those points in what we call Lipa na M-Pesa, which is pay with M-Pesa merchants. So we have 170,000 of them. So this is also about injecting money into those merchants so that they can operate during this period. And so far, for the month of April, we've spent 4 million, or customers have spent $2 million, and we expect another 2 million. So a total of 4 million by the time that Bonga for Good is complete. The other initiatives that we have thought about and we think will be critical is support around during this period to make sure that, as the other panelists have said, we pay on time. And we are starting to think about partnering with others to support supply chain financing, because using our distribution infrastructure with M-Pesa, but partnering with the banks and other FMCGs who use a lot of SMEs. We are thinking about supporting our customers' SMEs through digitizing their operations so that you can enable them to work from home. And even as the economy opens, we know social distancing rules will not allow them to have employees at home. So that's the other area. We have an incredible facility around cashless. So we are enhancing that, making user experience better. And we also think going forward, there will be an opportunity to use technology to allow SMEs to be more in control. So I'll stop there for now, but I think there's huge opportunity to use digital and technology to support SMEs through this period.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Peter, for sharing that, and indeed confirming, together with Murtaza, what can be done and what is indeed being done also by larger companies to respond in a responsible way, aligned with the Global Compact principles, and how this is really critical at this time. I'd like to turn it back to you, Dorothy Dembo from the Trade Center. Despite these great efforts by companies on this panel and many others, of course, you did talk about the very significant fall in demand, and indeed we are, despite all of this, seeing many small companies shutting down. Could you talk just a little bit as we're getting to the end of this panel discussion, and we'll look at some of the questions coming in from the audience, but could you just talk just a little bit about what effects do you see these permanent closures of small businesses have on the prospect for the economic recovery and for economies more long term?
Okay, thank you so much. Perhaps just before I briefly address that question you have posed to me, I just wanted to touch on something which was raised by the previous speakers, which relates to the fact that companies really need to understand what is happening on the ground. And I would want to add to that by saying actually it's the whole broad stakeholder group that needs to understand what is precisely going on the ground, which is in part why we have reached out and provided the necessary market intelligence at no cost at all to all our stakeholders, with the sole objective of making sure that they all do understand what is prevailing, what issues that creates, and how they can collectively or individually try to find solutions going forward. Why is this important? I think if you don't know what your situation is, you really don't know how to respond in an effective way. Example of this, a lot of trade measures were put in place, but very much primarily focused on addressing, mitigating the human aspects of what the health aspects of what we had been confronted with. Tariffs put in place, export measures put in place. The impact on that on business was not one that was at the forefront of those that were putting in place the measures. So it remains critical that that side of things is actually addressed. Why is it important? Which brings me to perhaps the question that you have posed, if I have understood it correctly, is that we need to keep the markets going. We cannot afford to have a situation where we put in place measures that at the same time undermine what would be a fundamental component of ensuring the recovery process. Because if MSMEs are not empowered to be able to function and be able to do business, the recovery is really one that comes into question. Second aspect, I would say we should be looking at options or opportunities that arise out of this situation. What is the opportunity being created in this particular respect? The possibility of finding different ways of doing business. And here, Peter and others have spoken to the steps that are being taken, seeing more of mobile facilitation, mobile solutions, facilitating trade, using more of the e-commerce, e-com side of e-com platforms to actually be a potential solution. The point I'm making there is that we just have to be open to see what is it that we can do in terms of trying to find options. So getting into a situation where we get the virtual space to be an opportunity for us to engage with stakeholders, to be able to sensitize them to the issues, but more importantly, to be able to provide them with practical solutions. And there I always say we need to take into account the different categories of businesses that we have. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution. And finally, taking an environmental approach as a deliberate way of us being able to respond. I think this gives us an opportunity to be very conscious of that fact and be able to use that approach in terms of trying to also move in a direction where we try to reduce reduce our costs. ITC very much aligned with the call to action. And this is why on our part, we have the 15 action plan that we are committing to this whole process. But we believe this is the absolute way we need to proceed to make sure that we're very concrete in terms of what we collectively can do in terms of supporting businesses on the ground.
Great. Thank you very much for those wise words. And I think we're quickly running out of time, but wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions coming from the audience. And there are two questions that have come in that are, quite related, and that also builds a bit on what you were talking about, Dorothy. So I'd like to pose those two questions really as also an opportunity for the panelists for some final remarks. You can kind of prioritize one of the other questions as you think it's most important. But the two questions that have come in, I'll read them out here. The first one goes, when a crisis occurs, SMEs need to use their reserves to keep their business alive. Is it possible to do this while remaining ethical and maintaining a focus on the SDGs, and how? So of course, this relates also to what the UN Secretary General has been talking about in terms of trying to use this crisis, after all, to build back better, to make the post-COVID-19 economy, based on the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. But again, the question goes, how is that possible for an SME where there's obviously such a crisis unfolding and a focus on short-term survival? I think the second question related here looks at this a bit more from an institutional perspective, a government perspective, asking, should we support SMEs selectively and prioritize those that promote a green economy and social inclusion? Or should we forget about these priorities right now, as SMEs are important for job creation? I think two very important and very difficult questions, but I'll ask them to all the panelists nevertheless, and do one last round. I'll go with the same order. So John from the ICC, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, look, thanks very much. Great questions. And in a way, they're real-time issues. And I think it's what people are grappling with at a policy level. This afternoon, I'm actually speaking on a panel with the Asia Society with former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, and Laurence from Paris. And the issue we're talking about is how we ensure that we don't lose sight of this SDGs and commitments to Paris in the context of COVID-19. I mean, the opportunity exists for structural change to support both. And that's actually with the fiscal headroom which is being created, what do you do with it? There are better choices and worse choices. A better choice, and this can also be extremely supportive of SMEs and micro SMEs, is to invest in the kind of structural changes that will be needed to continue to propel us along the way to diminishing carbon footprints and diminishing the impact on climate. A better outcome is to choose to make choices in terms of stimulus packages to support reduction in inequality and therefore alignment with the SDGs. And there are policy choices that can be made to support that. I mean, governments can choose, for example, to refit in a purposeful way public buildings and to provide tax incentives to support the refitting of private buildings as well to ensure alignment with Paris commitments. But importantly, one of the consequences of that is you can actually also comply with SDGs, because in increasing the capacity of buildings to withstand different climatic temperatures or changes, you can actually help poorer citizens and lower middle class citizens to actually lower their energy costs. There are, as I said, there are better choices that can be made in order to support the SDGs and action on climate. But these are purposeful decisions that need to be made. My view, and the view of the ICC, is that we don't put commitment to the SDGs and our commitment to Paris to sleep, to hibernation during the period of COVID-19. As I said, there's actually important policy choices that can be made, and we are urging governments and businesses to make those choices at this point in time to ensure that we do continue to align. SDGs and climate are not nice to have, they're actually must-haves.
Thank you very much, John. So the same two questions also for you, Mortaza. How do you see the role of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement for SMEs or for those supporting SMEs today?
Well, I think I look at it as a massive opportunity. I think this is one of the biggest opportunities of our times right now, is how to remodel your business, how to reassess where you were, where you are, where do you want to be. One thing that is positive in all of this is that because there will be demand destruction, overproduction will go down. There's some statistic, I don't want to quote the percentage, but a very large percentage of apparel that's made in the world ends up in landfills. So while in the short term it can be painful, in the long term it might not be the worst thing. I think companies in the supply chain have to remodel, whether you're small or you're big. Some of the SDGs are not capital intensive. If you look at this crisis from a gender lens, you can already see in countries like Pakistan, in countries like Bangladesh, garment workers a lot of the garment workforce is women, and women are massively impacted by this crisis because they are in most cases the sole bread earners of the families. So I think SDGs, some of the SDGs are already embedded, are natural, are part of the future economy. So I think a lot of that can be done. And I think it's a very, very big opportunity for companies.
Thank you. Peter, Ndegwa, Safaricom, do you agree? Any final words from you also related to these two questions?
Yeah, they are great questions, and I do agree that we should not lose focus on sustainability in dealing with a short-term issue. I think there's no question that the crisis is an opportunity for us to take stock of what has worked in the past and what we could do in the future. I think this is the opportunity for us as organizations and also as institutions, whether they are government or others, to bring purpose purpose to life. You know, our business in Safaricom has always been about making commercial decisions that meet shareholder returns, but also making a big impact on community and have we incorporated the essence of what SDGs are about within the way we do business. And that's the way we are looking at it during this period, which is making sure we don't leave anyone behind. And whether this is at a policy level with government or actually whether it is a support level with SMEs. The reason why the SMEs question is so important with respect to SDGs is it supports the most vulnerable. It actually reaches the person on the ground, including the informal sector. And therefore supporting SMEs through both the direct support but also policy intervention will make a material difference. But then I think the most important is to make sure that we carry everyone along and we don't leave anyone behind, to make sure that at the end of the crisis, everyone feels there's always something that has come through in terms of bringing us together, in terms of being more inclusive, but also in terms of actually being more sustainable in the future.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think you're very right that this is really the moment for companies to demonstrate what it means to be purpose-driven and what it means to leave no one behind. And indeed, short-termism and short-term challenges have always been the main challenges for sustainability and sustainable business. So I'll give the last word really to you, Dorothy. From the perspective of the International Trade Center, are you as optimistic as our other panelists in terms of the role of the SDGs in these coming months and years?
Thank you very much. And I agree 100% with all that has been said by the previous speakers. I think not, meeting the SDGs or indeed ensuring that in that process we are taking a sustainable approach is not an option. It's something that has to be achieved. And I perhaps wanted to add 2 quick points to what has already been said, which I fully align myself to or align myself with. One is that the question being posed to me if is one that one has to take into consideration whether this is a choice that you're asking somebody to make who's already engaged in the production process, or is it a choice that we are asking somebody to make who is coming on stream? Because for these 2 situations, it would be a completely a different ballgame. Why do I say this? If I'm already in a system and are already in progress in terms of making my processes sustainable, the systems are in place. It's not like I will wake up today and change the whole scenario to be able to make myself a bit more profitable. And I wanted to share with you the experiences that we've had from the work we are doing within the context of the Trade for Sustainable Development hubs, which are the initiatives we are using to work with producers and businesses on the ground to adopt more sustainable ways of producing, and in so doing, trying to see what the effect has been in that context. Clearly, the messages we have been getting from Ghana, from Asia, and from other parts where we are active is that they have found concrete benefits of taking the sustainable route in terms of managing their production processes. Clearly, in certain respects, they have found that it's not only environmentally friendly, but cost-wise, in certain respects, it has also proved to be much lesser. But there are also instances where perhaps this cost has been high, but taking a more medium to long-term view, understanding that that will bring additional benefits. The final point I wanted to make is that in many cases, markets are the ones that will determine the requirements that the products have to, the products that have to be met by the different producers. So whereas I may want to produce something in a very different way, if I'm really looking at exporting a particular product, I must comply. And this is not about international standards. This is more to do with the voluntary standards, which are demanded by those that are buying the products. And you have very little recourse in terms of trying to shift that requirement. And therefore, you are obliged in many ways. And most of what we are seeing from our side is that increasingly, most of these are asking for requirements that are, that fit into the sustainability criteria that we are looking at.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. I'm afraid we're out of time. This was a really tremendous panel. Some very wise insights, but also concerning facts from around the world around the impact of the COVID-19, the economic impact, social impact of also on SMEs in particular. But I also really thank the participants for calling out so clearly, a number of steps that can be taken by larger companies, by governments, by financial institutions to really help SMEs through this crisis. And I'm really glad that we ended on a relatively positive note in terms of all panelists seeing also a way for the SDGs to stay top of mind and to really provide a way for the recovery, or direction for the recovery phase. So a really warm thanks to this great panel on behalf of the UN Global Compact. Thanks to John Denton, to Peter Ndegwa, to Dorothy Thempo, and to Murtaza Ahmed for being with us today. And thank you for all of what you and your organizations are doing in this time of crisis. And thanks to our participants from joining us all around the world. This session, as well as the rest of the Global Compact Academy's special COVID-19 session, is recorded and can be watched online. So please share that with colleagues, with peers, with your networks. You can find the different session recordings either on the UN Global Compact website or on our YouTube channel. There is another session next week already around accountability, integrity, and transparency. Again, looking at that critical discipline for business in, through the perspective of the current pandemic. And then I would like finally to call out to all of you that the UN Global Compact's Leader Summit is happening in now only 3 weeks. It's going to be 26 hours of programming, really chasing the sun, and with great perspectives from all around the world. There's a link to the registration here in the chat box. So please join us for that momentous event. That's all for now. Thank you again to the panelists and to the participants, and may you all have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.